a lot of people have been very enthusiastic about my coverage of Metal Gear Solid 2 because this is a game I cannot stand. I've been very vocal about how much I don't like the game, how I think it's a mess, how I don't think it really contributes much to the Metal Gear lore, the mythos. I don't think it evolved the gameplay in any meaningful capacity. I hate how it's a rehash of the original. Like, there are just so many things that talk about MGS2. It's such a complex game. It is, I think, going to be a multi-video long project kind of dissecting everything wrong with this. It might even take a couple of playthroughs, actually, to kind of process how I feel about this game and its plot, because there are things to like about Metal Gear Solid 2, and there are things that you have to really go into depth about explaining why you don't like it, in spite of those things, right? Again, this is a really interesting piece in gaming history, because I think this game is objectively terrible. I think it's awful. I've always said that, but like, it's a lot more debatable, I think, than most games. Because when you look at like modern equivalents, when you look at like The Last of Us or Mass Effect or all of that stuff, like, it's all like very shallow liberal propaganda, right? When you really get down to it, you can see that, like, oh yeah, these guys are like, the writers were woke leftists from California, yeah. You know, they all believe this, and this, and that's why things happen this way, and why this character does this, and like, you know, they're trying to push the message, right? Like, Metal Gear Solid 2 is really interesting because it looks to me as if it's utilizing those same cliches and those same tropes, right? The 90s equivalent of like The Message, right? Converted through like a Japanese lens, but because this is coming from a creator that doesn't necessarily understand the purpose behind it, the intention behind woke messaging, what ends up happening is that the game kind of flips around and becomes unbelievably based instead. Like, it's really odd sometimes, right? You know, actually seeing like what the characters are talking about and what they're saying, and just being like, kind of like, holy shit, Kojima just exposed the fact that the president doesn't control the United States, that he doesn't have any real power. Like, that's kind of crazy to see like a game like this kind of address and point out to like a mass audience. And it's really frustrating to see like just how many people don't really process what Metal Gear Solid 2 is implying through its story. Just how insane the amount of control the people who control the country actually have over essentially everyone, which is essentially what makes MGS2 as a meta-narrative so interesting, is that it pretty accurately depicts every character being actively controlled through some method or means behind our comprehension. In that sense, it is incredibly, unbelievably based. But that being said, this wasn't intentional. This isn't what Kojima like set out to do. What ended up happening, as it happened with like The Matrix and other similar products that came out around the same time, they observed reality. They decided to make a movie about it, and as a result of that, they exposed way too much of how the world actually works, and exposes a lot of people to the reality of our current political climate and what's actually happening. You know, even if it's not exactly right, even if it's not like intended to be red-pilled, right? The reality is that this kind of story, even if it's a complete accident, gets people asking the right questions, and it leads people down the right path. You know, the path of the red pill. You know, the fact that the term red pill came from The Matrix and pretty adequately describes the process of like kind of waking up to the reality beyond you. Even though it all obviously was unintentional, it still clearly had a major cultural impact. And this is why Hollywood and other creative outlets have had to like really just buckle down and like push the message overtly going forward, because too many people were waking up because of the stuff they were producing by accident that adequately explained why people were so miserable and why things didn't seem to get better or improve, or, you know, what was really happening. So in that sense, Metal Gear Solid 2 is an unfortunate accident, because although Kojima intended to produce a subversive soy-filled game that shit all over the original and everyone that liked it. The reality is the creators had enough artistic integrity to do a lot with this that would not fly today. I suppose the comic book equivalent would be Watchmen. This is supposed to be a story about how superheroes are bad and how they're fascist and how Batman would be a crazy creep in real life, and you're insane if you think these people are cool, and like you're immature if you actually read comic books. It's supposed to be this criticism of the entire comic book industry, the entire superhero genre. But instead, it really depicts everything wrong with Alan Moore's worldview. The fact that he can't understand why people find Rorschach's actions compelling. The fact that he gets so frustrated with people who find him to be an interesting character or likable. The fact is, the character was intended to be unlikable. He was intended to be a propaganda piece for Moore to push his worldview, but the audience interpreted it in a different way. And as a result of that, Moore, even though he desperately wanted to push the message in the story, completely and utterly failed. He may have respect, he may have fame, he may unjustly have this legendary comic book creator attached to him, but the reality is he's a complete and total fraud who never really delivered anything of value to begin with. Much like Kojima, he tried and failed to create a specific message, and people took it the wrong way. People understood that the story was meant to represent something. It was supposed to have some kind of meaning behind it. But Moore's intention was for the story to become propaganda. The idea for Watchmen and for Metal Gear Solid 2 was for people to come away with a very specific idea of what the story was meant to be. But essentially, everyone rejected the message, and as a result of that, Moore and other comic book creators and other people in Hollywood and Kojima himself have increasingly become, overt in their messaging. They can't make the message as subtle as it is, as subtle as they used to, because they've realized that people will completely miss the point, misinterpret the work, and take away the wrong, quote-unquote, lesson from what the story is trying to tell us. So Metal Gear Solid 2 was intended to be subversive, but it completely fell flat on its face and instead comes off as incredibly based. And I do think an interesting aspect of this, and the subject of this video, is the dynamic between Jack and Rose, the star-crossed lovers. Jack's moral center and someone who is supposed to represent who Jack is as a person. She is the one person throughout the game who really emphasizes that there's more to Raiden than what we know, right? Raiden's basically pretending to be Solid Snake throughout the entire thing, but Rose is the one who constantly talks about his personal life, his background, and kind of pretty adequately emphasizes right off the bat that Raiden is not really who he pretends to be. That there's something really wrong with him boiling under the surface. And we don't know what it is, right? We don't know what exactly is wrong with Raiden, but the implication is that he's a complete bitch. The impression you get listening to these codec calls and listening to their conversations is that Rose is a complete utter failure as a woman, and Jack is in this relationship with her where all she does is just complain incessantly about things he does. They sleep in different rooms. He doesn't spend the night with her. He She doesn't want him talking about how dirty her room is, right? She gets uppity over the silliest things. And it's supposed to represent like normal relationship dynamics. It's a lot like The Simpsons, right? Where like the idea is that it's supposed to be things that like couples actually go through. But when you think about it for 2 seconds, like what's actually happening is incredibly dysfunctional and wouldn't actually fly in real life. And this is a really good example. Rose is supposed to be part of this military operation, but for some reason, she's spending her time on this critical mission to destroy Metal Gear, talking about our relationship, my feelings, like your room, it's as empty as your soul. It's like, wow, she's complaining about the furniture. This is the critical issue of MGS2, the thing that really holds it back, the thing that like really makes this game inferior to the original and the sequel. The game is so fixated on being subversive and portraying Raiden as much of a loser as possible while still trying to keep an ounce of credibility that it really loses all impact. Like, you can't go the first 3 hours through this game and come away with like a good impression of Raiden, right? He doesn't know anything that's going on. He doesn't understand, like his support team doesn't respect him, right? Like there's all this thing about Raiden that don't really make any sense. And it's supposed to be asking you questions about the character, but like what ends up happening is that you just end up really resenting all of the things that don't make sense. You don't want to hear Rose complain about Raiden not loving her enough. You don't want to see Vamp like run across the water like a Looney Tunes character, right? You don't want to see like this guy that you just met, just have a heroic sacrifice, have this speech like, oh, by the way, I was faking having my leg blown off because I felt bad about it. Like, it's just like, what? Like, none of this. The really frustrating thing about MGS2 is that you feel as if they were a lot more clever with this, if they were able to expand on their ideas and really make it hit harder, like a lot of these ideas could have worked, but the simple fact of the matter is that they don't. When you really look at this game and what it tries to accomplish, it fails at the most basic premise, making you care about the protagonist and what he's going through. And Rose is an essential part of the problem in this sense, where because the character exists, because she won't stop complaining about Raiden and the things he does and what he says and the things that happen in the past, right? Like, because of Rose and her inability to make Raiden come off as a more complex character, what ends up happening is that you just really hate them both. And you just really start to resent everyone on the support team. Like nobody seems helpful. Nobody wants to point you in the right direction. Everyone's withholding information. Everyone's complaining all the time. And it's like, that's the point. That's what they're trying to do. But at the end of the day, this isn't what people wanted. People wanted a fresh, original story set in the Metal Gear universe. They could have made Raiden work as a protagonist if they made him more interesting and emphasized his more positive traits, which they did by Metal Gear Solid 4. And that's supposed to be the point, is that Raiden is supposed to be his own person as opposed to, simply being an imitation of Solid Snake. But like, it just doesn't work. Like, when you really get down to it, because they put the subversion front and center, they forgot to make a good game around it. Like, there's not really much to Metal Gear Solid 2 other than some slightly improved controls and better animations. Better cutscene direction, maybe. Some of the longer expositions are kind of nice. But when you really playing this game, it really comes across as if this specifically is when Kojima fell off, because there are just so many times in this game where you just don't care about what the characters are saying, what they're talking about, what they're implying. They straight up lie to you sometimes. It's like blatantly lie to you. Like, there's no real good plot twists that involve the characters. It's kind of remarkable how characters like Solidus, like Vamp, like the President, Johnson, characters like that, that should be big deals in the MGS universe, don't really leave much of an impact or an impression at all, compared to their predecessors. Like Liquid is a far better antagonist than Solidus, because Solidus just doesn't really have the same kind of presence. Liquid actually talks a little bit about his motivation, what he wants to do, what he wants to accomplish, his scheme. He pulls one really good one on Snake near the end, right? By tricking him into triggering the detonation codes, right? Like the villains in 2 don't really have that same kind of humanity. They don't have that same kind of depth to them, right? They have facts about them that people will exposit towards you in codec calls, but they don't really feel like fleshed out, interesting characters. They have all these big expositions about oh man, this isn't really a cleanup facility. The Patriots, lule, but it doesn't really mean anything. You know what I mean? It doesn't really leave that much of an impact on the player or even the characters. Raiden doesn't even bring up the Lule after Ames names drops them, when Ocelot confronts them, in the hostage storage room, right? Where all those guys are being kept hostage. There are interesting things going on in the plot, but all of it is shoved to the side to focus on things that don't really matter. So this is why I hate Metal Gear Solid 2. It's not because it's intended to be woke or because it's supposed to have a message behind it or because of any of the other weird meta things. The issue fundamentally is that it's not a very good game. And there are lots of reasons for this. There's lots of things we can talk about in regards to this subject, but at the end of the day, MGS2 did not live up to the legacy of the original game.